Welcome to Nightmares Incorporated, where our goal is to make your sleep anything but restful. So sit back, relax, and enjoy part 2 of the Precursors. My name is Daniel Mears. I'm an investigative journalist for the Bridgeton Gazette, based out of Virginia. Currently, I am in a safe zone established by the United States military 45 miles south of Bridgeton. The city itself is in ruin, as is most of the East Coast. As I'm sure you're aware, something has attacked. Something inexplicable, which rose from beneath us, something which had been metastasizing right under our feet like a malignant tumor. The safe zone is currently anything but, as we are surrounded by these horrors that arose from the sewers, the lakes, and the rivers. But they won't attack. Not yet, at least. We are being given time. No, I am being given time. I have been instructed to finish the story I had been working on before what is being referred to as the Rise. I have been provided with the missing piece to my story, information that not only fills in the blanks on the missing persons case I was writing about, but also what is happening, and how it came to pass. The information was given to me for the express purpose of writing as coherent a timeline of events as I can, and then to upload the story online, so that those within currently unaffected areas may be aware of what is happening, so they may know what is coming for them and why. I was given this information by a thing that I don't bear thinking about right now, along with a week to write what it called the Final Testament of Mankind. So no pressure. I've been here for 3 days trying to collate my thoughts, trying to decide how I will write this. There are literal monsters rolling through the streets of a currently unknown number of American cities. There have been reports of these things surfacing in other countries as well. I've been at a loss about how to write a story about that. I've been distracted by the fact that I will likely be dead within the next 4 days, along with all the people with me in the safe zone. And while the words, the Final Testament of Mankind, were delivered with as much contempt as someone describing a termite infestation from the thing that I spoke to, it does feel like I'm doing just that. I hope not. I hope there are wiser people out there making their own accounts about what is happening. I hope there are historians creating documents of what might be humanity's final days. Men and women who can write poetically about the human journey upon the earth. Documents that can retell our history, our wars, our triumphs, the wonders that we built, and how, when extinction came for us, we fought to the bitter end. I hope there are people out there doing just that. That's beyond my scope. I'm a reporter. I deal with facts and informed opinions. I can't write a final message for humanity, but what I can do is provide a timeline and some answers as to how it happened. I can't say that it will help, but maybe it will. Forewarned is forearmed, they say, and while most of the world is currently aware of what is happening, perhaps it will help to know why it is happening, and what exactly we are facing. For myself, it all began with a story I was writing about a research assistant named Gerald Adler who had gone missing from the Heritage Foundation in Bridgeton, Virginia. It was local news, sure, but still pretty high profile considering there was talk that he had stolen an interesting new sample that had arrived at the foundation a couple months prior to his disappearance. I was already familiar with the Heritage Foundation, as I had written a story about it when it had opened its doors 10 years ago, interviewing the founder and head researcher, Dr. Alan Richards, the very man who Adler had been the assistant of at the time of his disappearance. I had written another story about Dr. Richards 5 years later, a kind of puff piece which highlighted an award that he had received for apparent breakthroughs in the study of hereditary diseases. I even attended the ceremony they held for him and shared a few drinks while I tried to understand what exactly he was talking about as he explained the breakthrough he had made. I only include this so as to say I was not exactly a stranger to Dr. Richards, which is what made the brief interview I conducted with him following the disappearance of his assistant so strange. Now, I wish I could say in hindsight that the man's demeanor when I spoke to him in his office 9 months ago should have been a sign that something was off, but only a fool would say such a thing. At the time, I figured at best he knew more than he was letting on, but I didn't see a reason as to why he would hide it. As far as I could tell, there was no money to be gained from deception, and his reputation would be ruined if he was implicated in a theft or something worse. Not to mention likely criminal charges if he had anything to do with Adler's disappearance. However, Richards had been evasive during my brief interview with him, providing very little information, only that Adler was a complicated man, and young. Maybe he just decided that DNA research wasn't for him and headed out for greener pastures. I wish I could help more, but I really didn't know him all that well. His body language was off too, sitting up straighter than usual, and not talking with his hands as he was prone to do. He also didn't maintain eye contact with me for very long at any point, but not in the way of someone being deceptive. While I couldn't really explain it at the time, I got the feeling that he wasn't keeping eye contact because he considered me beneath his notice. Knowing what I know now, I believe that to be the case. I don't think I was speaking to Dr. Richards that day. I was speaking to whatever he had become, or was becoming, and it was humoring me, like someone who has a long conversation with their dog because they know it likes the sound of their voice. Even though I didn't get the feeling that Dr. Richards was being evasive for criminal reasons, his overall dismissive attitude towards the whereabouts of his colleague bothered me enough that I carried out a further interview with 2 members of the board of the Heritage Foundation. When I mentioned Dr. Richards' odd demeanor during my interview with them, they didn't seem too surprised by it. "Richards has never been the most personable," one of them said. "He's a good researcher, but he's not very fun at parties." I turned the conversation towards my reason for being there and asked them what they thought about Adler's disappearance and the sample that he may have stolen. The consensus was that Adler had never shown any signs of criminal behavior, and that even if theft were a motive for him, they didn't see the value in stealing a blood sample. I then inquired if they knew what the sample was and what might have been so special about it that theft could even be considered. "From what it states in the receiving log," one of the board members, a man named Brower, said, "it appears that the sample in question arrived from the cleanup being performed at Miskatonic University, that it was found in a crate marked Antarctic Expedition, September 1930. There was an ice pick in the crate that appeared to have dried blood upon it. I think the people who sent it to us wanted a positive ID that it was indeed blood before they had to ship it off to a larger forensic lab." Brower went on a little longer, but to be honest, I was kind of tuning him out. None of it amounted to much anyway, but that wasn't the reason I was blanking on him. The mention of Miskatonic University had given me a start, awakening old childhood fears that I didn't know that I still held. I think every kid who grew up on the East Coast heard plenty of campfire stories about Miskatonic. Tales of devil worship and black magic. Rumors of a library that contained books of the occult, some of which held knowledge that human beings were never meant to have. Stories about a museum that housed oddities collected during expeditions that the university funded to places like the Antarctic and Australia in the early 1900s. Some even said that the museum held a piece of jewelry that was said to have been crafted by hands that were not human and contained mysterious properties. But for the life of me, I can't remember if they said it was a necklace or a bracelet, or if the story changed depending on what they needed it to be. As I grew up, I came to realize that Miskatonic was just a university that resided in the tucked-away town of Arkham, Massachusetts, and at one time was as prestigious as universities such as Harvard, Yale, and Dartmouth. Nothing more, nothing less. Just a place of learning that had been built during the late 1700s, although as a side note, that was on par with the university's garbled history, because even this fact was debated by some since there were no official records of its construction. That sat in a town that had a history of urban legends involving wicked spirits and creatures hiding in dark places. A university whose attendance declined as the years went on and other colleges came into being. The satanic panic of the 1980s didn't do the university any favors either, as the old stories of arcane rituals and devil worship reared their ugly head again, as it seemed like someone was making a news story on the place every other week for a couple of years. Following that, it faded into relative obscurity, with a couple of scandals taking place in the 1990s that brought it back into the public eye for a few days before it died down. However, the death blow came in the mid-2000s. First, there was the disappearance of Professor O'Connell in the year 2010, and the subsequent psychotic break of a colleague of his, a man named Mark Davidson. Davidson injured 4 people following O'Connell's disappearance, claiming that they were not real, and that he had to get back. The poor man was restrained and confined to a psychiatric hospital for 5 years before he was released. While this certainly got people talking about the university again, it wasn't what killed it. That happened in 2012, when 7 students and a professor of theoretical physics vanished in what was reported as a flash of indescribable light from one of the science labs. Reports were conflicting, of course, but many believed it was the result of an experiment that had gone horribly wrong. In any case, the lawsuits that came from the grieving families proved to be the fatal wound, and the bad PR that accompanied them was the coup de grace. By 2020, with the added pressure of the pandemic, Miskatonic University became a hollow shell, haunted only by the professors who couldn't accept that the institution was now a relic of the past, that the world had moved on, as they say. And as if it served as the cherry on top, there was the fire that swept through there and devastated a good portion of Arkham a year ago. Many believe that it was the result of arson, but at this point in time, no one has been accused of the crime. The contents that could be salvaged from the university were being sent to colleges and museums around the country, as there were whispers of plans to rebuild the university as part of a project to restore Arkham after the tragedy. I remember thinking that that would be a good thing. I figured that 10 years from now, the rebuilt Miskatonic University would be the trendy place to go to college, that it would wear its rumored occult past on its sleeve like a quirky tradition. But I also remember the childish part of my mind thinking that anything that had been recovered from that place was probably bad news. In hindsight, the childish fear in me was correct. I know now beyond a shadow of a doubt that the sample that came from Miskatonic is directly responsible for what is happening now. But I'll come to that. It's better if I continue to tell this in chronological order so I don't miss an important detail. I only have one shot at this after all. It was a couple months after my interviews at the Heritage Foundation that the disappearances began. At first, it was just a few isolated cases. Individuals vanishing without any apparent reason. One by one, people disappeared. Their last known activities hauntingly mundane. Walking home from work, shopping at the local grocery store, or simply sleeping in their beds. But soon the numbers grew, escalating from a few dozen to a few hundred. Each disappearance became a shadow that crept into every corner of the community, spreading an insidious fear and suspicion among neighbors. Among the vanished was my wife, Rebecca, which plunged me into a personal nightmare. I remember the day with chilling clarity. She had kissed me goodbye in the morning, promising to return before dinner. When she didn't come back, an icy dread consumed me. I searched everywhere, called everyone, but it was as if she had been swallowed by an unseen malevolent force. This personal tragedy forced me to pause my story about the missing researcher. It seemed insignificant next to the growing horror. Only now do I realize how wrong about that I was. The city of Bridgeton was unraveling. Families had been torn apart, and there were no answers in sight. Within months, the phenomenon had reached a terrifying scale. Thousands of people had vanished without a trace, and that number seemed to be growing exponentially. Authorities were helpless, and the air was becoming thick with conspiracy theories. Was it an experiment gone awry? Alien abductions? Or something far more sinister? I now understand this was no random occurrence. Each disappearance, each piece of this terrifying puzzle, is linked to that sample retrieved from Miskatonic University. But let me continue in order, as there are crucial details that must be told. Before long, the phenomenon was no longer confined to Bridgeton alone. Reports started flooding in from surrounding areas, similar inexplicable disappearances that mirrored what we were experiencing. People were disappearing as if the air itself had consumed them, and communities were left reeling from the sudden, unexplained losses. The sense of dread that hung over our city began to spread like a contagion, infecting wider regions. In response, local authorities imposed curfews in a desperate attempt to curb the vanishings. Streets that once buzzed with life fell eerily silent after sundown, and a national emergency was declared as the number of the vanished climbed into the hundreds of thousands over the next 6 months. It soon became clear that it wasn't just people who were disappearing. The animal populations, too, began to run thin. Pets went missing from backyards, and wildlife sightings became increasingly rare. Some residents started reporting strange, unsettling sounds emanating from storm drains. Sounds that almost seemed to be whispering voices, eerie moans, and an occasional squelching, scraping noise that defied explanation. Mild tremors, like the premonitions of an earthquake, began to ripple through areas that had never been seismically active. These tremors were often accompanied by a low rumbling noise that seemed to come from deep within the earth. I could no longer ignore the growing evidence that we were dealing with something far beyond the realm of the known. Every new report seemed to peel back a layer of reality, revealing some terrifying truth that remained beyond our realm of understanding beneath. But at the time, I could not fathom the extent of what was happening. I don't think anyone could have. Yet the deeper I thought about this mystery, the clearer it became that in some way that I could not grasp, the very fabric of our existence was under threat. What kind of unseen force could erase life without a trace? People do not just vanish into thin air. They had all gone somewhere. But the question was where and why? What was happening to them? Who could possibly abduct that many people within that short amount of time without leaving a trace? These questions consumed me as I continued to try and piece together a narrative, something that could begin to explain the inexplicable. I began to piece together a theory that linked the disappearances to the disturbances in the animal populations and the strange sounds and tremors. It all pointed to something lurking beneath the surface. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the people who had vanished must have gone willingly, although for the life of me I couldn't understand why. I also couldn't grasp where that many people could have gone and not be found. Of course, during the first days, police and rescue teams searched the woods, sewer systems, abandoned buildings, all the places that you usually think of when people go missing. But as the numbers grew, the possible places where they could be seemed to be shrinking. At the Bridgeton Gazette, theories ran wild from every journalist that I worked with. Some speculated that the disappearances were the result of the aforementioned secret government experiments gone wrong, a theory that found its roots in the eerie precision and scale of the vanishings. These theories often centered around rumors of undisclosed military bases and covert operations that might have inadvertently triggered an unimaginable cataclysm. Others spoke of alien abductions, of course, an old standby for unexplainable occurrences, although there was never really any evidence of such to allow this one to gain any steam. No reports of strange lights in the sky, no close encounters of any kind. There was also talk about the possibility of a massive underground network of tunnels and chambers, dark and ancient, that might somehow be linked to the strange sounds and tremors. Some believe these tunnels could be the remnants of a forgotten civilization, while others speculated that they could be the lairs of a secretive and malevolent society. Much of this talk amounted to nothing, of course. When I think about it now, I realize that it was a coping mechanism, a way for people to keep their minds busy so they didn't have to focus on the impossible nature of what was taking place. We were all under the naive hope that if we could find an answer for the disappearances, then maybe we could do something to stop them. That understanding would lead to enlightenment. I believed that once myself. However, I now believe that some things can never be understood, even if they're explained to you. After some time, we began receiving ominous reports from the public. We began hearing terrified talk of oddly shaped, shadowy figures flitting through the woods under the cover of night by those who were ignoring curfew rules and risking jail time searching for their missing loved ones. These figures were often described as containing no concrete form, blending into the shadows, and almost spectral in appearance. Their movements unnervingly smooth and silent, like wraiths haunting the twilight. Local fishermen spoke of encountering a dark, viscous substance along the shores of lakes and rivers, a strange, jelly-like material that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. This substance clung to boats and fishing nets like a parasite, and emitted a faint, sickly glow, casting an eerie light on the dark waters. These sightings were infrequent, and according to the witnesses, they were filled by a suffocating sense of dread when they encountered the substance, as though the very air around them had become charged with an invisible, sinister presence. While there was never any physical evidence to accompany these reports, they were all similar enough to send chills down my spine. In hindsight, it became clear that all of these sightings were ominous harbingers of the horror that was about to be unleashed, that each of them was a sign that something was growing restless, venturing out to explore or to feed, that these things that people were reportedly seeing were invariably linked with the disappearances. It was almost as if the ground beneath us was alive. As the days passed, a feeling of impending doom began to grow and become more widespread. People began to stay in their homes even before the curfew, and entire cities were now shrouded in an unnerving silence. The sense of a disaster on the horizon was palpable, and it seemed only a matter of time before the malevolent force that seemed to be lurking in the shadows would reveal itself in full, horrifying clarity. The tremors intensified during the 2 weeks prior to the attack, sometimes strong enough to rattle buildings and shatter windows, always accompanied by that deep, bone-chilling rumble from the depths of the earth. I think at that point we all knew that something was coming, that something had been dwelling right beneath our feet. I think we all knew that the answers to where the missing people had gone were about to be disclosed. I was at work on the day that the rise began. We were going over a story that we were going to run on a researcher out of Cambridge that had come forward with a disturbing discovery he had made from analyzing a water sample that had come from Chesapeake Bay. He claimed that his preliminary tests had revealed that there was a foreign cell of unknown origin within the water, that this cell was so small that it likely had been easily bypassing modern filtration systems. Yet he admitted that such a thing shouldn't be possible, as this cell appeared to be packed with genetic material, almost as if it were a modified delivery system for something else. He was advising all news outlets that he could reach to run the story and caution people against drinking from any direct water supplies until the tests could be concluded. That he believed this to be the safest option, as he could not identify what this cell might belong to. We had debated for a little while on whether or not to run the story, unsure if it would result in unnecessary panic. But eventually we decided that it would be best to err on the side of caution. We knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that something was causing people to go missing, and if the tainted water sample was connected somehow, then it wouldn't hurt to caution the public about it. Paulson wrote the story based on the conversations with the researcher, a man named Clyde Mercer, using the words allegedly, suspects, and claims so much that it almost read as if he had asked an AI to write the story for him. But I could understand the careful language. If it turned out that Mercer was wrong, or just plain full of shit, it would be less embarrassing to the paper if we seemed to be skeptical of his claims the entire time. The earthquake began while I was in one of the offices of the Bridgeton Gazette talking with a coworker named Michael about my theory that although the sewers had been searched, that there was still the possibility that the people who had gone missing were underground. The earthquake was intense but short. The tremors shook the entire building, causing books and papers to fly off the desks and shelves. As the shaking subsided, an eerie silence fell over the office, an unsettling stillness that hinted at something more sinister on the horizon. In the distance, we began to hear inhuman roars, deep and guttural, echoing like the growls of some monstrous beast. The sounds were accompanied by the breaking of glass and the heavy thuds of impacts that reverberated through the air. We all exchanged anxious glances, the faces of my colleagues as pale with confusion and fear as I imagined my own was. A cold dread settled within my heart. We all rushed to the windows to try and see what was happening. The alien roars grew louder, and with them came the screams of people, desperate and terrified. We could see chaos unfolding in the streets below. Cars were overturned, their alarms blaring incessantly, and a crowd of people was running past the building, their faces twisted in fear, eyes wide with panic, as if fleeing from some unseen terror. Someone in the office, I can't remember who, grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but the line was busy. They tried again and again, but there was no response. Only the disheartening beeping of the overloaded system. Panic began to set in as the realization hit us at the same time. We were on our own, isolated in a world that seemed to have suddenly turned hostile, although we still did not grasp the true extent of what was taking place. I don't think there was any way that we could have. As the crowd outside grew larger, the cacophony of screams, roars, and crashing sounds became almost unbearable. I knew that whatever was happening, it was far beyond anything we had ever imagined. The inexplicable presence that had been lurking in the back of our minds for months now was finally revealing itself, and the true horror of the situation was only beginning to unfold. Amidst the chaos, I caught sight of an amorphous figure slithering through the crowd. an abomination seemingly composed of iridescent purplish-black slime. It undulated and writhed as if animated by a malevolent will. The creature did not look like anything that I could properly identify, and my mind ached as I tried to imagine how nature could allow such a thing to be born. How the sun had not killed it before it had had a chance for its perversion to grow. Eyes that glowed pale yellow and green covered the amoeboid body, and the creature emanated an aura of terror so intense that it could be felt even at a distance. We all watched in abject horror as the vile abomination began to engulf the fleeing people, its form rippling and shifting to ensnare its victims. The creature moved with a horrifying predatory grace, consuming humans with an almost mechanical efficiency. Each person it touched let out a blood-curdling scream that was quickly muffled as they were swallowed by the black, glistening mass. The sight of this thing devouring humans with such ease and brutality shook me to my core. I realized with chilling clarity what this was. It was as if some memory locked deep within me cried out and told me that this was not an isolated event. This was a harbinger of ancient, unfathomable evil. The creature's form was constantly changing, making it impossible to predict its next move, and its grotesque, gelatinous body seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. Unaware of the creature's true name and origin at the time, and unable to rationalize how such a beast could even exist, we could only stand frozen, paralyzed by a fear so profound and primitive that it seemed to stop time itself. The surreal and horrifying scene unfolding before us defied all logic and comprehension, leaving us to grapple with the terrifying reality that our world had irrevocably changed. There was no time for reflection or speculation, however, as soon the first horror was joined by others. Within moments, the street below was flooded with the pulsating, shifting forms of the abominations, the air seemingly alive with their growls and roars and the shrieking of their victims. Some of the shapes broke off from the main group, venturing into buildings and down side streets, seeming to be working in unison, almost as if they were setting up a grid pattern. "What the fuck is happening?" Michaels asked no one in particular. "It's an attack," I answered, knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was right. "We have to get out of here," someone else said, but they were cut off. "No, we stay here. We're on the 3rd floor. It's safer than on the—" I don't know who was speaking, but again the sentence was never finished, as our view outside the window was suddenly blotted out by a large ovoid shape. We backed away from the windows as a horror of tentacles, limbs, eyes, and teeth crashed through them as if it had leapt at us from the street below. While I'm not a religious man, I suddenly felt as if I was looking at something that had been freshly paroled from hell. From the moment that it landed on the floor of our main office, it was a hurricane of movement. I stumbled to the floor as I watched a tentacle grab Chalmers by his ankle and fling his body as if he weighed nothing at all, slamming him against one of the walls like a child playing too roughly with one of their toys, the sound of his bones shattering mingling with the breaking plaster and 2x4s of the wall. At the same time, one of the several mouths covering the formless body shot out as part of a newly formed appendage, the teeth ripping through the entire front of Sandra's torso, taking one of her arms as well. I screamed and tried shuffling backwards, unable to find my feet as the horror continued its malicious work. A pair of hands grabbed my shoulders as Michaels hauled me to my feet. He spun me around towards the door that led to the hallway and screamed at me to run, to make for the stairwell, that we had to get out of here. I began to, but turned when I heard his screams grow louder and unintelligible. When I turned around, I saw that 2 tentacles had wrapped around Michael's body, pinning his arms to his sides. I could see steam rising from his flesh as it appeared that the creature was feeding on him from its appendages. Blood ran down his forearms and soaked the bottom of his light blue button-up shirt as his screams of pain grew in volume. Suddenly, he was yanked backwards and engulfed in the loathsome mass of limbs and teeth. I wish I could say that I had tried to help him, that I tried to help any of my surviving co-workers. I wish I could say that I tried to think of a way to fight the horrific creature. But I didn't. We all like to believe that we will be the hero when the time comes, that when the chips are down, we'll rise up and bravely confront the danger that threatens us. But we tend to forget that many of our ancestors survived because they ran from the ancient predators that hunted them. They ran so that they could live to fight another day. So I ran. Down the hall, down the stairwell, and out onto the street. I cut down an alleyway and ran blindly, my mind fully consumed by fear. I don't remember much about that first 24 hours. I had been reduced to a creature of instinct. I remember the sounds of screams, of gunfire, of the alien roars and cries for help. I remember seeing fire and devastation on a scale that my mind could not truly comprehend. I remember that I ran for what felt like hours, stopping only briefly to catch my breath before I ran again. The stitch that had formed in my side and became nearly debilitating is what got me to seek shelter on that first day, although I could not imagine anywhere that could be considered safe, as the air itself seemed to be alive with screams no matter where I went. Finally, I found the ruins of a gas station. The broken windows and holes in the walls, clear evidence that the horrors had already been and gone. There was blood on the floor. I saw a bisected corpse, the torso lying upon the sales counter, the bottom half almost in a seated position in front of it. I began to laugh at the sight, and then to cry, and then to scream. I remember that I crawled behind the counter and curled myself into a fetal position, sobbing the entire time. When exhaustion finally took me into a fitful sleep, I remember praying that I would wake up and discover that all of this had been only a nightmare. I spent the following 2 days in that gas station, venturing out from behind the counter only to retrieve food and water, creating a pile of sustenance in my hiding place like a rodent. I kept myself covered with torn-apart boxes as much as I could, and didn't dare disturb the decomposing body that was mere feet away from me. I would eat what I needed, drink what I needed, and little else. I remember crying a lot, and laughing a lot too. I would imagine that I could hear voices along with the roars in the wind. I imagined that I could hear people solicitously inviting those who were hiding to just come out, that they could join the brood, they could be one with the Shoggoth. None of this made any sense to me. There was no way that these things could speak. While I couldn't venture a guess as to what they were, I knew they were monsters, and monsters don't talk to you. But I would then wonder if maybe they could. Maybe they learned our language through the people that they had taken. For surely these things are what was responsible for all the disappearances. So maybe they learned to speak. In retrospect, I now realize that I was experiencing something of a psychological break. However, I had not imagined the voices. I had just been wrong about how these things were able to talk. As I hid, I could still hear the chaos from the outside world. The roars of the things that had risen from beneath us, more gunfire that sounded of a higher caliber, indicating to me that perhaps the National Guard or maybe the full-blown military had arrived. Louder sounds that may have been bombs or missiles, or maybe just a gas line that exploded due to damage. If the military had arrived, I remember hoping that they were winning, but I was too afraid to leave my temporary sanctuary. I kept expecting one of those things to find me, or that if I stepped out from my hiding place, one of them would be on the street outside, waiting for me. I thought about my co-workers who had died, especially Michael. He had saved my life, and I couldn't even try to imagine the pain he must have experienced in the end. What does it even feel like to be devoured alive? To be fully absorbed, and I imagined either crushed, or even more horrifying, digested while you were still living. That one thought kept me rooted in place. Eventually, I might have decided to move on my own, although I don't remember having a plan on where I would go. Maybe I just would have stayed in that gas station until one of those creatures found me, or I lost my mind completely. In any case, I know that I would have died had it not been for the people who came across me. They were a group of 8. A man named Tyler seemed to be in charge, or at the very least, everyone else was following his lead. I had been terrified when he first discovered me, convinced that they were hallucinations, or some kind of trick from the creatures outside. But he had been patient with me, and given me softly spoken reassurances that they were real, and they were human, and that I could come with them if I wanted to. I remember that got my attention. "Go with you?" I had asked. "Go where? Where is there to go?" "The way I see it," Tyler had answered, "these things seem to be coming up, so we go down." Seeing that I was either having trouble understanding what he had said, or simply having trouble believing it, Tyler had elaborated. "Reports have been scattered, but we've gathered that these creatures rose from the sewer systems, abandoned mine shafts, lake beds, etc. They were underground. So, seeing as they're coming up now, we figure the safest option is to go down to where they came from. There's plenty of old sewer tunnels in the East Coast cities. One of them extends about 5 miles south, ending at a river. That's the one we're heading to." "But why?" I had asked. "Where are you going?" "Fort Dyer," one of the other men said. "I was stationed there. The military is currently evacuating everyone they can to the south, either to Fort Dyer itself or beyond, to safe zones that are being established." "You're in the military?" I asked the man. "Corporal Jason Henson of the United States Army. I was on leave." He then crouched down next to Tyler to address me more directly. "Sir, I understand that you're scared, and I don't blame you. I don't know what you've seen, but I can tell you what I've seen. Through observing how these things are moving, I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that none of this shit is random. This is a coordinated attack, and these fuckers are moving like they have one mind. They're also speaking, trying to lure people out." I jumped at that, and Jason took notice. "You've heard them?" I nodded my head in affirmation. "Right now, they are engaged with the National Guard and the local police 2 miles north of us, but the defense won't hold. Bullets don't bother these bastards, and explosives only seem to slow them down. Maybe when reinforcements arrive, they can hit them with something heavier. But trust me, sir, we don't want to be in the city when that happens. Right now is our best chance to move south." I nodded my head, seeing the sense in what he was saying, and the 2 men helped me to my feet. These people who did not have to take the time to get me moving are why I'm able to make this report. Tyler, Jason, Shannon, Julie, Ben, Hannah, Vincent, and Abraham. The names of brave men and women. The names of those who saved me. We began moving south, Tyler saying that the entrance we were looking for was no more than a mile away. We traveled slowly, as Jason said we needed to be on the lookout for any of the creatures that may have lingered behind the main group, doing what he called cleanup duty. The journey was mostly uneventful, other than the shock to the system that the sight of all the devastation provided. It appeared as if a bomb had hit the city, although very little of it was on fire. Pavement was cracked, the larger buildings showing signs of damage, smaller buildings mostly reduced to rubble. Blood and parts of bodies were visible almost everywhere. The vile, oily black substance that composed our aggressors left behind in streaks as if a reminder that none of this was a dream. We talked a little while we traveled, but mostly kept quiet out of fear of being noticed. Most of what discussion there was boiled down to speculation about what these creatures that were currently destroying Bridgeton were, and where exactly they had come from. Jason was of the opinion that they were aliens, an advance force sent by the actual aggressors to soften up the Earth for the main attack. Julie thought they were a government experiment in gene manipulation that had gone horribly wrong, producing monsters that had escaped their cages. Tyler speculated that these things were always here. He argued that they came from too many different locations to be an escaped experiment, and while they may be extraterrestrial in nature, he didn't think they had just arrived. He suggested that maybe something had been lying dormant just beneath the surface of the Earth, almost hibernating, or maybe locked in a kind of stasis, that something had woken them up and brought them into the light. "Don't they seem familiar to any of you?" he asked while we walked. Was it just me that felt like I knew what they were? That some primitive part of my mind recognized something about them? Like they were a long-forgotten nightmare? The rest of the group said that it was indeed only Tyler who was experiencing this feeling. But I stayed quiet, because I kind of knew what he was talking about. I remember feeling that I had recognized them as well. But for me, it felt more like a forgotten instinct rather than a memory. My mind had recoiled from them like it would from a snake, or a bear, or a giant bird, or any other long-standing threat to humanity's survival. I felt as if I was recognizing an ancient predator. We had nearly reached the sewer entrance when two of them found us. One of them slid out from underneath a car that was parked on the side of the street, pooling around the ankles of Shannon like sentient water, before rising up, engulfing her body whole as it did so. Her scream of surprise and pain was so brief as it covered her head and must have forced itself into her throat. We screamed on her behalf, and Jason tried to help her. He rushed at the creature, its dozens of eyes regarding him with what seemed like mild curiosity, while it continued to dissolve our companion. Before he got within 2 feet of the thing, an appendage seemingly formed out of nowhere, lashing out from its chest and striking Jason with such force that I could hear the breaking of his sternum and ribs as he was lifted off of his feet and thrown a few yards away, landing in a crumpled heap, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. We backed away and turned in the direction of the sewers, when another one rose up in front of us. This was the largest specimen I had seen so far, and it went a long way towards explaining the devastation I had already seen in the larger buildings. It was easily the size of a city bus, a hulking brute covered in eyes and what appeared to be hundreds of writhing tentacles and limbs. 7 mouths full of sharp, jagged teeth were visible, the surface of the creature undulating and quivering as if it were several of the monsters all grouped into one. We froze, and I was convinced that we were about to die as the beast regarded us with the same sense of apathy that the other one had. However, instead of attacking us, the creature moved aside, lumbering down a street that was to our right. And when we turned, the one that had killed Shannon and Jason had left as well. "What the fuck?" Tyler asked the surrounding air. Ben and Hannah went to Jason, checking for a sign of life that I knew they would not find, but I understood why they checked all the same. "We need to get off the street," I suggested to Tyler. "But why did it stop?" he asked. "Maybe it didn't care about us," I replied. "Does it really matter?" "No," he agreed. "I guess not." He spared a mournful look at Jason before we got moving again. "He saved my life," Tyler said to no one in particular. "More than once. He deserved better than that." They both did. We all silently agreed and then proceeded on, turning on the few flashlights that Tyler's group had brought and venturing down into the dark of the sewers, into what we hoped would be relative safety, at least until we reached the river. We walked in silence as we made our way down the first long disused sewer tunnel. I think part of the silence was due to caution, as we had no idea what might have lingered behind down here. I think the rest was due to the shock of what had just happened on the street above. It was a stark reminder of the horrors that had taken place over the last few days. The ease at which we could be dispatched by these creatures made perfectly clear, if it hadn't been already. The air grew heavy with each step we took, the unfamiliar dampness of the sewers laden with an ominous tension. In the dim light of our flashlights, we began to notice a foul, gelatin-like substance smeared on the walls, floor, and ceiling. It oozed slowly, glistening with an otherworldly sheen, a chilling reminder of the creatures that currently terrorize the surface above, their presence still lurking in the shadows of the underground. Our footsteps echoed softly, the only sound against the oppressive silence, until faint, unidentified noises began to emanate from adjacent tunnels. Each distant clatter or whispering shuffle made our hearts race, putting us even further on edge. The sounds ranged from soft, almost indistinguishable murmurs to sudden sharp clinks, as if something unseen was watching and following us. We exchanged uneasy glances, our nerves fraying with each passing moment. The urge within me to turn around and leave was almost overwhelming, but the knowledge that there was nowhere to retreat back to kept me going. Our best hope was to reach the safe zone that the military was establishing, so we marched on into the unknown. Despite the growing fear that spread among us, we pressed on, the hope of reaching the river and being one step closer to escaping this nightmare driving us forward. The darkness seemed to close in around us, the smell of decay and damp earth thickening the air. Every so often, we'd pass by areas where the gelatinous substance was more concentrated, pulsating with an eerie glow. A few milky green eyes seeming to float on its surface. Shadows danced and twisted in the corners of our vision, playing tricks on our already frazzled minds. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, whispering threats of doom. Suddenly, a guttural growl echoed through the tunnel, freezing us in place. The sound reverberated off the walls, growing louder and more menacing. We huddled together, our breathing shallow and ragged, as the noise seemed to come from all directions. It felt as if the very darkness itself had come alive and was creeping closer, suffocating us with a sense of undiluted malice. We moved forward, faster now, spurred on by the primal fear that coursed through our veins. The tunnels seemed endless, an alien labyrinth that threatened to consume us. But we clung to the slim chance of survival, determined to outlast the horrors that hunted us. We ran as a group, Tyler in the lead, fleeing almost mindlessly from the noises that surrounded us. running away from them as best we could, trying to keep our bearings and continue moving south. It wasn't long before I was acutely aware that we were lost, however. We weren't making any real progress. We were only trying to avoid going down tunnels that the alien growls were coming from. Once we reached a large round chamber, I came to the disheartening realization that we had been herded like cattle. In front of us, there were at least a dozen of the creatures, all roughly the size of a small car. From the tunnels behind us, we could see the slightly luminescent eyes of our pursuers, not advancing, only blocking any escape. They had set a trap, ever since the one who had left us alone on the surface, I imagined. They led us down here. Panicked chatter from the group, myself among them, all of us speaking at once, debating whether we try to fight or run, although I believe we were all acutely aware that neither option would be viable. It was then that a voice cut through our circular discussion, the utter inhuman quality of it silencing us as if we were obedient students.
"Be silent,"
the voice had said. It was an ageless voice, the voice I would imagine the night sky to have if it suddenly gained the desire to speak. We all looked in the direction that the command had come from. Stepping out in front of the creatures that had been lying in wait for us was a humanoid figure. Humanoid in that it was bipedal, and still had human facial features. But the rest, Jesus God in heaven, the rest. Tendrils, perhaps a foot long, extended out from the being's head, neck, and shoulders. The skin was the color of a rotten plum, almost appearing like a full-body bruise. Parts of it pulsated as if breathing. Two mouths, one that was possibly a foot wide, the other half that size, moved soundlessly on the being's torso. Milky green eyes ran down the abomination's arms, and a few were visible on its stomach. But the face was still human. And that's what caused me to retch. Not only because the sight answered many of my unanswered questions about what had become to the people who had vanished, but also because I recognized the face. The thing watched on impassively as I emptied the contents of my stomach on the sewer floor. Once I had regained my composure, I addressed the horror that stood before me. "Dr. Richards?" I inquired. The others with me gasped, likely shocked that I recognized this thing, but also because they were making the same connections within their minds as I had.
"This one knows you,"
Dr. Richards said as it, regarded me. "What happened to you?" I asked. "What are these things? Why are they doing this?" Dr. Richards continued to regard me with the barest hint of interest, not answering me at once, appearing to be contemplating something. Finally, he looked down at something that was on the floor between us.
"This one used that to record their thoughts. You are a storyteller, are you not? This one calls you a reporter."
I looked down at what the doctor was gesturing towards and saw a voice recorder on the floor. "Yes, I'm a reporter," I answered. I considered asking him why that mattered, but thought it was best to keep quiet. We weren't dead yet, so maybe this could work out in our favor.
"You may take that with you,"
the thing that used to be Dr. Richards continued.
"All of the answers to your questions are on there. You will be permitted to tell the story of the rise from the human point of view, since you have been blessed to be present for the beginning."
"What?" I asked. "What are you?"
"We are Shoggoth, and we are allowing you to tell the story of the end of your kind. You may record the final testament of humanity. This one thinks it a kindness, but this one has not been blessed to fully evolve yet. This one is still very human.
I considered that for a moment, the revelation of what it was saying seeming too large to wrap my head around. I settled on the only answer that seemed to make any sense, as if there was any sense at all in this situation. It was the sample you received from Miskatonic, wasn't it? I asked.
The answers you seek are on there,
The Richards thing replied.
You may go now.
I wanted to ask more questions, but decided to heed its instructions. I stepped forward with more than a little trepidation and retrieved the voice recorder, trying not to pay too much attention to the gelatinous material that was stuck to it in places. So we can go? I asked once I stood back up, repulsed by how close I was standing to the Richards thing now.
You may go,
the creature responded. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could hear desperate whispering from the group behind me. No, I said, thinking that considering it seemed like this thing wanted something from me, that maybe I could have ground to negotiate on. Either we all go or I don't. I never got the chance to finish my ultimatum. From behind me, there was the sound of several guttural roars and noisome slithering. The screams of the group that had rescued me followed, echoing down the empty sewer tunnels, becoming a symphony straight out of hell. I hear those screams every time I close my eyes. The creatures could have made it quick, but they chose not to. The Richards thing stared at me with disinterest as I screamed along with my short-lived companions. Once the screaming had stopped, I dropped to my knees, sobs racking my body, my gorge rising in my throat again. I looked up at the Richards thing. Why? I asked.
Their only use was nourishment,
the creature replied.
Nourishment, and what's left will be bonded with fresh offspring. Something it can use to grow and change. Something that will be added to the brood. That was their use. Yours is to tell the story of the beginning of the end. Now go,
the creature repeated.
The vehicle this one used is parked outside the third exit down the tunnel at the back of this chamber. You will be allowed safe passage to the temporary safe zone your military is establishing south of here. We will watch your progress. Once you are there, we will allow you 1 week to record the final testament of mankind. Then, we shall destroy the compound, and you, along with all others there, will be used for nourishment, while some will be blessed to evolve into us. Ultimately, all of you shall be added to the brood, one way or another.
The creature fell silent, and punctuated that it was done speaking by pointing towards the tunnel I was to use to leave. I had to walk past the horrors that stood behind the Richards thing, the Shuggoth, as I left. I completely expected it all to be a lie, and for them to engulf me as I drew close, and to be honest, I welcomed the prospect. My mind was teetering on the edge, my self-preservation nearly gone. But it wasn't a trick. The abominable things parted for me as I drew close and allowed me to leave. The rest of my trek through the sewer is a blur, as is starting up the car that was outside and the first part of my drive south. I remember crying a lot, and then laughing, and then both at once. I remember impressions of the devastation I saw as I drove towards Fort Dyer. Buildings that had been completely torn apart. The oily black shapes of the Shoggoth were everywhere. There were thousands of them, all different sizes. Some crawling up the sides of buildings, others slithering through the streets. Many of them simply watching me as I drove by. And while I can't explain it, all of them felt like the Richards thing was looking at me. At one point, I saw something that my mind refuses to completely remember, as if my brain had gone into emergency mode and burned the memory before it could fully form. All I can recall is the vague outline of a creature that was nearly the size of a 5-story building. I'm still not sure if I actually saw it. I'm choosing to believe that I didn't. I listened to the voice recorder while I drove south. I figured that I'd hand it over to whoever was in charge when I arrived there. I figured whatever information was contained on there might be able to help them. The gist of it was this. Dr. Richards received a sample of unknown material from Miskatonic University as a result of the cleanup effort since the fire. This sample apparently contained DNA from an ancient life form that was created due to experiments from something that was not of this planet. That the creatures that resulted from these experiments were used as a labor force until they rebelled and chased their creators into the oceans. It was all fucking insanity. A whole civilization and history that humanity never knew about. It shouldn't make any sense, but it did. 4.5 billion years passed on this rock before the emergence of human beings. In reality, just about anything could have taken place during that time, and due to erosion and environmental changes, any civilization that existed would be all but buried or reduced to dust, as if it had never existed in the first place. The folly of humanity is that we actually believe that we understand everything about the world in which we exist. But I digress. Apparently, the DNA contained within the sample inexplicably was still alive, and Richards accidentally got infected with it. From what I could gather from the recording, it seems that this DNA contained a consciousness of its own, and it quickly overrode or assimilated Dr. Richards' mind, using him to infect and abduct Adler. After making sure that the infection had taken hold, he moved his assistant's mutating body to the sewers, using him to contaminate several water supplies from the sound of it, infecting thousands in the process. The things we're fighting, these Shoggoth, they used to be us. All of the missing people, our friends, our family, my wife, all turned into these things. It's as if some of their genetic material still exists within our genome, and these new cells latch on to that ancient DNA and spread throughout our system, mutating us into one of them. They claim that they're the original life form, that we are nothing more than an accidental byproduct of their creation. I say fuck that, and fuck them. These things are nothing but parasites. They need us to survive. I shared all I knew with the captain on site when I arrived, and they're currently preparing a defense. Even though, from my window in my room, I can see that the fort has been completely surrounded since the day I arrived. I'm more than likely dead as you read this, along with everyone else that was here. At least I hope I am. As far as I know, I might be one of these shambling fuckers, a part of the brood as Richards called it. I leave this as my final statement. This is our planet, regardless of where we came from. Don't stop fighting. Don't relent. Don't let these things win. And if you can't stop them, if defeat is inevitable, then burn it all down and salt the earth behind you. I don't know if fire kills them or just hurts them, but Richards talks about it in his recording. He says they'll retreat to the oceans if they need to. Then I say leave them nothing to come back to. Glass the fucking planet and condemn them to the same watery prison that they drove what they call the Masters into. If humanity is going to hell, then I implore you, take them with us. Daniel Mears, August 23rd, 2025. Thank you for joining us here at Nightmares Incorporated, and we look forward to seeing you next time when we bring you another original story. Until then, sweet dreams.